This is part 100 of SQL Server tutorial. In this video, we'll discuss how to send a data table as a parameter to a stored procedure. This is continuation to part 99, so please watch part 99 before proceeding. In the previous video session, we created this SP insert employees. This stored procedure accepts a table variable as a parameter. Here is what we want to do. We want to design a web form that looks like this. This web form can capture up to 5 different employees' details. For each employee, we can capture ID, name, and gender. So when we click this Insert Employees button, we want to call this stored procedure SP Insert Employees. Now, the data that we have on the web form, we want to retrieve that into a data table, and then we want to pass that data table to this stored procedure, and this stored procedure is then going to insert all those 5 employees into this employees table at once. Let's see how to achieve this. The first step here is to design this web form, which I have already done. So here is the HTML. So the text boxes here are actually in a table. So here we've got a table, and within the table we've got 5 different rows for 5 different employees. For each, within each row we've got 3 TDs for ID, name, and gender. And look at the text boxes, look at the naming convention. So I have named them txt ID for ID, similarly txt name for name, and txt gender for gender. For the first employee I have used number 1, for the second employee I have used 2, so on and so forth. So all the text boxes are present within this table. Above the table I've got this fill dummy data. So what is this button? This button is to populate all these text boxes. If I have to type 5 different employee details manually, it's going to take a bit of time. So to save some time, I have this button here. When I click this, it's going to fill some dummy data into these text box controls. And when we click this Insert Employees button, we want to store that employees data into the employees table. So the first thing that I'm going to do is double click on these button controls to generate their respective click event handlers. We're going to write some ADO.NET code. So I have already typed the required ADO.NET namespaces here: system.data, system.data.sql client, and system.configuration. Within our web.config file, I also have a connection string that's pointing to our sample DB database, where we have our employees table and our insert stored procedure. So within our code behind file, so within button fill dummy data click, that is when we click this button, we want to populate these text boxes with some dummy data. So I have that code right here. So I'm going to copy this and paste that within that button click event handler. So what is this doing? Within the text box, ID text box is storing 1. In the second ID text box, it's storing 2, etc. Similarly, it's storing some employee names and their respective genders within those text boxes. So if you look at this at the moment, when we click on the button, all it's going to do is populate these text boxes with that data. Now when we click the insert button, we want to retrieve this data into a data table, and then we want to call that database stored procedure, pass the data table as a parameter to it. So within our button insert click, the first thing that I'm going to do is read the connection string into a variable, and for that we are going to use the configuration manager class, configuration manager.connection strings of, and the name of the connection string here is dbcs. So dot connection string, and then let's use the SQL connection class. So SQL connection, let's call it con equals new SQL connection, and to this let's pass the connection string variable. And then let's create our SQL command object. Let's call it cmd equals new SQL command, and we will have to specify our command here. The command is actually going to be our stored procedure, SP insert employees. So I'm going to pass that to the SQL command object, and then we'll have to specify the connection object as well. So we are going to pass this connection object to the command object. Since this command object here is executing a stored procedure, we have to tell that to the command object. So command.command type equals command type dot stored procedure. And if you look at this stored procedure, it has got an input parameter, a table variable as an input parameter, and that's the name of the parameter. So let's create a SQL parameter object, and I'm going to call this param equals new SQL parameter, parameter dot parameter name equals, that's the name of the parameter of our stored procedure, parameter dot value. So where is the value going to come from? Now we want to retrieve the data from the web form into a data table. So what I'm going to do now is create a private function here, and this private function is going to return a data table, and let's call this get employee data. So all this function is going to do is retrieve the data from the form into a data table. So I'm going to create a data table object here. So data table, let's call it dt equals new data table, and then I'm going to specify columns for our data table. So dt dot columns dot add, and I'm going to specify the name for our column. So I'm going to use ID as the name. So what columns do we need within the table? We want to capture for each employee ID, name, and gender. So we want those 3 columns. So dt.columns.add ID. Similarly, we want a column for name, and we want a column for gender. And then let's add the rows. So dt.rows.add. So what do we need to do now? We need to provide values for ID, name, and gender. So I'm going to add it for the first employee, and for the first employee the ID value is present in txt id1.text. So that's the text box which has the first employee ID. The name is present in txt name1 text box, and finally we want the gender of the first employee, and that is present in txt gender1. So we need to retrieve the data for the rest of the employees. In the interest of time, I have already typed the required code for the rest of the employees, so let's copy that from the notepad and paste it right here. So this retrieves for the second employee, and then for the third, fourth, and fifth employee. So we have added all the rows to our data table. What else we need to do? We need to simply return that data table from this private function. Okay, so now I'm going to call this private function right here, get employee data. So this is going to retrieve the data from the form into a data table, and this function is returning that data table, and we are setting that as the value for this parameter. And we need to associate this parameter with this command object. So command.parameters.add, and the name of the parameter is param. And then we need to open the SQL connection. So connection.open, and this is going to be an insert operation, so we can use command.execute non-query, and finally close the connection. So straightforward ADO.NET code here, nothing different. All we are doing is retrieving the data from the form into a data table, and we are passing that data table as a value for this table variable parameter. Okay, alright, so let's go ahead and run this form one more time. When we click this fill dummy data, we have the data within the form. Now before I click insert employees button, let's go ahead and check what data we have in the employees table. Notice that at the moment the employees table is empty, and I'm going to click this insert employees button. Now let's select the data. Notice that we have all the 5 employees data within this employees table. So here is the code that we have just written. Thank you for listening, and have a great day.